You are 9 months pregnant. There is no hospital, no epidural, no doctor on call, no sterile room, no fetal monitor, no emergency button to press. If something goes wrong, there is a fire. A few women you have known your entire life, and the most dangerous moment your body will ever face. This is not a nightmare. This is every human birth for 300,000 years. And somehow, against odds that should have been impossible, most of those women survived. Most of those babies survived. And the knowledge that made that possible was so sophisticated, so refined, so accumulated across thousands of generations that modern medicine is still catching up to parts of it. This is the story of how ancient humans gave birth. And the women at the center of it are the most overlooked specialists in the entire history of our species. Start with the problem. Because the problem with human birth is enormous, and it is biological, and it began the moment our ancestors stood upright. When humans became bipedal, the pelvis narrowed to support upright walking. At the same time, human brains were growing larger, which meant human skulls were growing larger. The result was a collision, a baby with an enormous head trying to pass through a passage that evolution had simultaneously been making smaller. No other primate faces this problem at the same scale. A chimpanzee birth is difficult but manageable. A human birth, without any help, is frequently fatal. Estimates from anthropological research suggest that without intervention of any kind, roughly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth across human history. 1 in 3. In a hunter-gatherer band of 30 people, that was not an abstract statistic. That was the woman sleeping next to you. That was your sister. That was the person who had walked beside you for every year of your life. The tribes that survived were the ones that refused to let that number stand. And so they built something. The moment a woman in a hunter-gatherer group realized she was pregnant, the entire group began to shift around her. Researchers who have studied modern hunter-gatherer societies, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aka of Central Africa, the Kung of the Kalahari, have documented what this shift looked like in practice. Other women in the group, particularly older women who had already given birth multiple times, immediately began adjusting their behavior. They took over portions of her physical labor. They ensured she received extra food. They began sharing knowledge accumulated across decades of experience. This was not kindness. This was engineering. Because the group had learned, across generations of watching what happened when this support was absent, that a woman who went into labor exhausted, malnourished, and alone was a woman who very often did not come back. And at the center of this system was a role so ancient, it predates agriculture, predates writing, predates almost every institution human beings have ever created. The midwife. We have physical evidence of this role that reaches back further than anyone expected. In 2014, researchers analyzing skeletal remains found evidence of bone stress patterns consistent with someone who spent years kneeling and physically supporting laboring women. These were not helpful bystanders who happened to be present. These were specialists. Women who had attended dozens of births, who had developed techniques, passed down through direct apprenticeship, that no single generation could have discovered alone. They knew how to read the position of a baby through touch before any scan existed. They knew which positions reduced labor time and which ones increased the chance of tearing. They knew which plants reduced bleeding, which plants encouraged contractions, which plants dulled pain. Researchers have now identified more than 50 plant species used by indigenous cultures across the world for childbirth management, many of which contain compounds with real and measurable pharmacological effects. Ancient midwives did not know the chemistry, they knew the results, and they passed that knowledge on. The preparation for birth began weeks before labor started. A specific location was chosen. Always away from the main camp but never far enough to be unsafe. Somewhere with soft ground, natural shelter, and access to clean water. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa and Europe shows these locations small clearings, with unusual concentrations of tools, plant remains, and fire ash that do not match the pattern of ordinary camp activity. These were dedicated spaces for birth, built, used, remembered, and passed down. When labor began, the woman was never left with a single person. Typically 3 to 5 women surrounded her, each with a specific understood role. The most experienced midwife monitored progress, feeling the position of the baby, tracking dilation, watching for the warning signs that something was going wrong. Another woman provided physical support, letting the laboring woman lean back against her, bearing her weight during contractions, moving with her as her body demanded. Others maintained the fire, prepared medicinal plants, and kept watch. Because labor could last hours, sometimes days, and the sounds attracted attention from things that came out at night. The laboring woman almost never lay on her back. That position, still standard in many modern hospitals, is a product of convenience for physicians, not comfort for the woman giving birth. Ancient women squatted, kneeled, stood, and moved. Gravity helped the baby descend. The upright positions opened the pelvis more effectively. Modern obstetric research has confirmed that upright labor positions reduce delivery time and reduce the need for intervention. Ancient midwives had reached this conclusion without a single clinical trial. They had reached it by watching thousands of births and noticing what worked. When something went wrong, they had protocols. A breech baby, positioned feet or bottom first, was one of the most dangerous complications in any birth, ancient or modern. Hunter-gatherer midwives knew how to reach inside and manually turn a baby. They knew how to manage a cord wrapped around an infant's neck. They knew how to apply pressure to stop hemorrhaging that could kill a woman in minutes. These were not guesses. These were techniques refined through direct transmission across thousands of years of practice. When the baby emerged, it was placed immediately on the mother's chest. Skin to skin, warm close. The placenta was delivered carefully and examined, because experienced midwives had learned that a retained placenta, one that did not emerge fully, could cause an infection that killed the mother in the days that followed. The umbilical cord was not cut immediately. They waited for it to stop pulsing, allowing the remaining blood still moving through the cord to transfer fully into the baby's body. Modern medicine called this discovery delayed cord clamping. It became standard clinical practice in the 1990s. Ancient midwives were doing it 50,000 years ago, possibly longer. The recovery period was not optional and not brief. For weeks after birth, sometimes longer, the new mother was exempted from the physical labor that occupied every other member of the group. Other women brought her food, helped her nurse, cared for her older children. The Hadza and Kung communities that anthropologists have studied most closely show that women who received this structured postpartum support had significantly higher survival rates for both themselves and their infants, compared to those who did not. The tribe had also developed something that modern obstetric research has only recently begun to quantify: continuous emotional support. A study published in the journal Birth analyzed more than 15,000 deliveries, and found that women who had continuous support from a single experienced person throughout labor had measurably shorter labors, needed fewer medical interventions, and reported significantly higher satisfaction with the experience. The effect was strongest when the support person was experienced, but not medically trained, not a doctor, not a nurse following a protocol, a person who knew them, a person who had done this before, a person who was entirely focused on their well-being for every minute of the process. This is what ancient women had. This is what most modern hospitals do not provide. Modern labor is often attended by rotating staff, who have never met the patient before. Sterile rooms, machinery. The importance of movement during labor confirmed. The role of continuous emotional support confirmed. Delayed cord clamping confirmed. Upright birth positions confirmed. The pharmacological properties of plants used by indigenous midwives still being studied, still yielding results. In 2019, anthropologists working with the AKA people of Central Africa documented birth practices that likely trace back to our common ancestors. The AKA midwives use techniques, positioning, plant medicines, and support structures that mirror archaeological evidence from sites 40,000 years old and older. An unbroken chain of knowledge spanning the entire length of human existence. The women at the center of that chain were not primitive, they were not guessing. They were specialists operating within the most sophisticated knowledge system available to them. One built through direct experience, refined through failure, and transmitted with the understanding that the next generation's survival depended on getting it right. They were the first medical professionals in human history, and most of us have never heard their names, because they never wrote them down, because the knowledge they carried lived in hands and memory and demonstration, not in texts that survived. The knowledge did not disappear entirely. It lives in every culture that still honors the role of the midwife, in every woman who sits beside another woman in labor and simply stays, in every tradition that understands birth as something a community does together rather than something a woman endures alone. Your ancestors did not survive 300,000 years of birth because they were tougher than you. They survived because they understood something that modern medicine is slowly, carefully, and scientifically beginning to rediscover. Nobody should have to do this alone. They never did.